So today we're going to be working on adding the value to our distorted portraits. And we're going to do the value with the material we've been waiting to use all semester long. We're finally going to use our ink wash and our pen and ink. So I just wanted to run through a couple things. Remember, you started this project by taking a photograph, portrait, head and shoulders, a face, and putting a grid on it of squares that are 1/2 inch wide by 1/2 inch tall. And then we made a corresponding grid on a larger piece of paper that created a distortion by making those units instead of squares into rectangles. So you can see here, I zoomed in. This is the demo I did for you last time. I zoomed in just on her eye, and these are the distortions that were created from that. So remember that on this example, we kept the height essentially regular. This is about a 1 inch height, but I increased the size of it to 2 inches in width, and you can see how it stretched the eyeball outward. This one is also fairly strange. This one keeps a 1 inch distance in terms of the width, but creates a 2 inch height, so it stretches the details upward. So remember that as you're working on these, as you're doing the distortions, something to look for is where you can find a contour line that touches one of the borders of your grid. This point almost touches that unit right there where these 4 squares kind of come together. So that needs to be here, and we're imitating that curve as it goes to the next unit. The analogous part here is this little dot moving across to this side. So we worked on creating the distortions. We talked about making sure that we're only putting in the major outlines and contours and not bothering with a lot of shading or cross-hatching. So you should have something that looks kind of like this at this point. Now obviously I went in and used a Sharpie to darken my lines to make it easier for you to see on screen. Yours should still be pencil at this point, but you can see this is my distortion in which I've made the face shorter and wider than normal. The next step, though, that you're going for is to start adding the value. This is my distortion in which I've made her narrow and stretched her up to be skinny and tall. And you can see I started putting in some value with my ink wash. Now, this one, of course, is the one that's done with the Sharpie outlines. So I moved on to a version that didn't have Sharpie, that just had the pencil lines. That's closer to what you guys are doing. So with this one, and I spent most of Monday's class while the students were working, I was adding in value using ink wash to this drawing. So there's the original photograph. You can see that she's definitely squished in and stretched up tall. And what I'm doing here is applying value using diluted ink, or an ink wash. The ink wash, I recommend working from lighter values to darker values and working in layers. You can put a light value down and then add the next darkest and then the next darkest. It depends entirely on the image that you chose as to what kind of values you really want in your ink washes. My example has a fair amount of light and middle gray, not a ton of super, super dark black. A lot of you have the reverse. A lot of you have images that have very jet black backgrounds with lots of dark shadows. Yours is probably a little closer to mine in that you might want a little bit lighter values. So you can custom mix these yourself. I'm going to show you how that works. Move her out of the way. So on your desk in front of you, you've got a bunch of different supplies. You should have, pretty much in the same order that I have, a cup that has jet black ink in it, full strength. Then you should have 3 cups with just clean water. Even though the cups are messy, the water in them is fresh. It shouldn't be diluted yet with ink. You have an eyedropper that's going to help us pick up the ink and create our washes. And you've also got a couple of brushes. So I tried to give everybody one that was small and one that was a little bit larger. And obviously the larger brush is for doing larger areas. You should also have a ceramic cup to wash your brush out with clean water. And you can continue to refresh that. You can dump out dirty water and get new as you go. You'll also have a pen holder and 2 pen points. So your pen holder looks like this. The pen points themselves look like so. And I gave everybody a wide one like this and a narrow one that looks like that. So the narrow one comes to a really sharp point. These slide in and out of your handle, and if you look at the handle under the light, you can see how there's a circle there. The non-drawing end of my nib, N-I-B, that's what these are called, the drawing nib, the part that you're not going to draw with is round and curved, and it fits into the curve of the pen holder, like so. The business end is more obvious on the thicker point. The end that goes in is curved. It goes into that curvature right there. So those pop in and out, so you can change them. I have a couple different sizes as well if you want to experiment with that, and I'll put those out where you can get at them. When you're using these, you don't have to dip the handle into the ink. It's really just the pen point, just the nib. It works much better if you hold them essentially as close to horizontal as possible. So don't hold it straight up. Hold it like so. And pull rather than push the pen. Pull the pen in the direction of your dominant hand. I'm right-handed, so I would start my marks on the left and pull to the right. But if you were left-handed, you'd go the other way. You'd start on your right and pull to your left. Especially with the smallest point tool. Let's see if I can get this close to the camera. Doesn't really want to focus there, but can you see there's like a little hole there? Sort of an oval. And if you look really closely, you probably can't see it on the video, but there's a little bit of a slit. The pen point actually has a little cut in it. So it comes to technically 2 points at the end. That little slit there helps the ink kind of travel to the tip. But the key thing is that if you imagine these two tips, like my two fingers, if I push on the pen, I'm going to end up eventually getting those things to start to cross over each other. And it's going to make the line come out really thick. It's going to start scratching your paper. It's going to drag up a lot of the fibers of the paper itself and turn your pen point almost into a little mop. So always remember, try to keep it as horizontal as possible and pull in the direction of your dominant hand. So making the ink washes. Again, this is my full strength black. These are all just cups of pure water. It doesn't really look clean on the screen. And when you make your mixes, I guarantee you, you're going to have a hard time telling with the naked eye which is the light one and which is the darker one. So I would work on this like we did with our value scales. Start on one side and work from left to right. So this is going to be my lightest value, middle, and dark. You take your eyedropper. I'm sure you have used these before, right? You squeeze the bulb, which creates a little suction. Put that into the ink and release, and it pulls some ink into the eyedropper. So what we're doing is putting more ink in each of these cups as we go from left to right to make one lighter and then darker and then darker. So I'm going to put about 15 drops in here. 1, 2. That was about 15. I'm going to try to put closer to 30 in the second one. Need to reload. I'm going to put closer to 50 in this one. That's about 18. It's about 40. Okay, and there's no hard, fast rule or law that says exactly how many drops. And you can custom mix these so that you establish the values that you need based on your photograph. But I was trying to err a little bit on the side of having some lighter values. For the moment, I'm going to use the non-drawing end of one of my pen holders to just stir those up. Rinse it off. And then I just want you to see what those values look like. So I'm going to dip my brush here into my lightest value and draw a little bit with it on my paper. Rinse it off. Grab my middle value. See, that's much darker. And of my three mixes, this is my darkest. That's definitely a darker value than its neighbor. Of course, where you need it, you can use full strength black as well. So for those of you who have, especially like the figures that are wearing dark clothing, like your suit jacket looks pretty close to jet black, so you could fill that area in with your brush. Your pens are pretty simple. You dip them into the ink, hold it almost horizontally, and pull. So if you bear down a little bit, the line will be a little thicker. If you use a very feather-light touch, you can get a really thin line. If you use the heavier weight one or thicker tip, it's going to make a wider line. So we can do hatching and cross-hatching just like we always have. More marks closer together equals darker. But you can also use your pens to create the effect we call stippling, which looks great for smooth things like skin, metal, so forth. The idea is using a series of dots and putting those dots closer together and more of them where you want an area to get darker. I don't know if you can really see that on the screen. Let me try to zoom. There you go, you can start to see that now, I think, right? It's a little tedious, but the nice thing about the stippling effect is that when you pull back and look at it from a little further away, it more easily blends in your eye to a smooth gradation from light to dark, as opposed to, remember when we did cross-hatching and everything looked really textury? It was kind of hard to make things like those boxes look really smooth because we had all that like line work on them. So you can use a combination of the ink wash, hatching, cross-hatching, stippling. I would work, honestly, on the ink wash part first, put in your lightest values, then work on your darker values and build up the image from there. Use your pen at the end to go in and do your fine details, outlines, contours. But probably the best strategy, I think, for right now would be to concentrate on applying your ink wash, working from light to dark. So just as a quick example, if I go back to my original image, there she is. Whew, that's spooky. Okay, you can kind of just barely see her face at this point, right? If you look at my photograph, the white of the paper is really much lighter even than the background, isn't it? There's a little bit of tone there. So I might start by applying with my larger brush some of my lightest value and just painting that in. And you can see, imagine how long this would take if you were having to crosshatch all that. I can fill a big area pretty fast. Now, the ink wash will dry slightly lighter than it looks as the water kind of evaporates out of it. So this area will probably look a little lighter in 15 or 20 minutes. But once you've got an area filled in, you can manipulate the brush strokes a little bit, make it a little cleaner. But once you've established an area like this, the edges, of course, of this shape are really wet. So what do you suppose would happen if I tried to put the value of her shoulder or her hair right up against that edge? It's going to bleed like watercolor, right? So you really do want to let some time pass before you put something right next to it. You can, however, do layering, and that really works well in the hair. So let me do a section that has kind of a base. Let's work on the other side. Let's do a base of a light grayish color here in the hair. And I'm rushing a little bit so that you have time to work. Let's imagine that that has had some time to dry. To speed it up, I'm going to blot it with some paper towel. And of course, that's going to remove quite a bit of the ink. So this will come out even lighter than it was a minute ago. And you can do this on purpose. If you have an area that you think is too dark, while the ink is still wet, if you do this simple press and lift, notice I'm not scrubbing back and forth like I'm washing a dish in a sink. That pulls out some of that excess moisture. All right, that's going to allow me to go on top of that a little more quickly. What if I decide I'm going to use a bit of this darker tone? And I can leave gaps in between it to create those highlights in the hair. So notice that this value is now even a little darker than it was just by itself, because it's sitting on top of a value that we established earlier. And if I rush it again a little bit, so it'll still be kind of light, I should be able to put even darker on top of that. You see how that's starting to create the effect of highlights and the texture in the hair, right? So I would work from light to dark. Remember that things are going to bleed if you put a wet area next to a wet area. You absolutely can work on top of an area that you've already established with another value. So you can be very subtle by building up your lightest value on top of itself. I could just lightly increase the darkness here by adding a little more of that light value on top of itself. So you absolutely can manipulate that way. If you have an area that is too dark, while the ink is wet, do the press and lift, don't scrub. Even if you have an area that has dried completely, you could put clean water on top of it and let that sit for a minute, and then press and lift. You'll be able to lift some of it back up. I absolutely recommend doing your line work last, because if you do the lines first and your value washes go outside the lines, it's going to look like you made a mistake. And the reason I suggest that is the very first time I had to do one for class, I did it exactly that way. I did all the pen work first, then I did the value with the ink wash, and it was terrible. Like the values just went all outside of the shapes. So save the pen for the end. Everybody clear on what to do? All right, great. Have fun, make some washes, and make some weirdly distorted faces.